Well, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. Indeed, my name is Sharon Schnieder. I'm coming from I'm coming from Tel Aviv, but I am based in Berlin, Germany. I'm working in World Courier since 10 years and functioning as the regional quality manager for EMEA in the last 5 years. I'm very honored to be part of this session today, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to discuss a little bit about vendor qualification, especially what will happen post-COVID-19, what I assume will be post-COVID-19. So vendor qualification applies to all segments of the industry, as well as for the advanced therapies. The pandemic obviously changed some plans for companies and regulatory bodies in the short term. New challenges came along to keep the public health and regulatory bodies were forced to find a solution in this time for approving a GMP or a GDP facility. The industry actually can learn a lot from this approach of the regulators and adapt also post-corona times other methods for vendor qualification in order to act more agile in the future, and by that also to support the organization's goals and still keep the high level of quality. A remote audit is a perfect method implemented. It was known already prior to COVID-19, but it was left almost forgotten before. Why was it left untouched and how we can adapt it in the future is a little bit my topic today. I'll talk in general about qualification of vendors according to the EU GDP guidelines and a little bit about the remote audits, the regulators and accreditation bodies' point of view, and then a short summary about the agile quality approach. Yeah, so you are probably familiar with the EU GDP guidelines published in November 2013. I assume also you are familiar with Chapter 7, outsource activities, which discuss the qualification process of vendors and also defines the responsibilities of contract giver in performing a formal qualification. The word audits is mentioned, but it's not specified. It's not further detailed or specified. The assessment of the suitability of the contract acceptor goes beyond the initial selection and approval and should be a feature of an ongoing relationship between both parties. And this is as long as the contract is valid. Exactly here, a remote audit could play a vital role. The auditors or assessments, the audits or the assessments should enable the contract giver to understand and mitigate risks associated with the activity which is outsourced. Auditing is only one part of ensuring an ongoing performance of the contract acceptor. According to the risk identified in the outsource activities, there are other assessment methods that can be considered, performed, and the rationale behind choosing a certain method should be documented. Well, I listed here some possible methods in this slide. Prior to the COVID-19, the most common methods were the on-site audit or questionnaire or a combination of both of them. Remote audits were considered by many as not effective enough due to the limitations associated with this method. But is it indeed an audit that is not as sufficient as an on-site audit? I'm not sure about it. And how did the regulators react when the pandemic started? Yeah, so the COVID-19 has a serious impact on citizens, patients, and of course the businesses. The legislation aim always is to ensure the highest level of public health and the continuity of medicinal supply chain needed to be granted. With the associated lockdowns and the contact restrictions all over the world, suitable solutions to ensure further inspections and continuity of the healthcare business must have been found to maintain public health still in very low risks. When the different rules and regulations were published in the past, so before the COVID, for example, the GDP in 2013, nobody even thought about a pandemic situation and the limitations associated with such a scenario. Therefore, when the COVID-19 impact was known, the regulators needed to adopt a more agile approach for inspections in order to ensure the continuity, the high level of public health, the quality and the safety of available medicines, and a secured supply chain. I invite you here to have a look on the different published information from accreditation bodies and regulatory agencies containing updates on actions during the COVID-19 situation. For example, the ISO and the International Accreditation Forum, IAAF, guidance from April 2020, so guidance on remote audits. The MHRA published on the 23rd of March 2020 the first article about good practices inspections during COVID-19. And there is the EMA and the HMA published in April, and also they were sending an update in May, and after it in July. And there are some more regulations discussing this topic. They all of them, so in common, they all adopted an approach, even if limited, of course, that is much more agile and in certain circumstances allow and accept to perform a remote audit in order to maintain the business in the pandemic situation. I'm quite confident to say that we will see in the future, post-corona times, some updates or changes in the regulations that will include guidance for pandemic situations, what we don't have currently in the guidance itself, but in the updates. But for this, we will have to wait and see. A remote audit, actually, in this case, is no longer a bad choice. In fact, it has many advantages and can and should be considered not only these days, but also in the post-pandemic times. So what is a remote audit? I guess you all know, but just a little bit the definition. A remote audit is exactly the same as an audit, but using electronic means to obtain the audit evidence and to evaluate it objectively. One of the challenges in several cases is indeed related to the evaluation of an evidence being objective, as the transmission of the information in this case is being done online. In the ISO guidance on remote audits, which was published in April this year, the definition of a remote audit mentions the value of its method in providing flexibility to achieve the audit objectives. If this method indeed provides flexibility, not only in achieving the objectives, but also in other means, how come a remote audit was left almost forgotten prior to the COVID-19? I'm showing here on the screen a white paper published by DQS, one of the world leading certification company and a well-known company. These are the results of a survey they performed prior to the COVID-19 in December 2019, which shows almost half of the participants were not considering a remote audit as a positive method. In fact, 29 were neutral, 13% were negative, and 58 were positive, but even then, remote audits were hardly performed, even if the approach was positive. It might be that the regulators did not accept this method, or at least were not fully open to accept and implement a remote audit in the past. So the rest of the industry followed them as well. The next slide will show a part of the published information from the European Commission and the European Medicines Agency, in particular to the remote audit methods. The Q&A on the regulatory expectations for medicinal products for human use during the COVID-19 from April, May, and then updated again in July, specifically recommends to perform remote audits if appropriate, justified. Other operations are listed also in this document, so not only the audits. With the COVID-19 travel restrictions and the lockdowns, it was not difficult to justify a remote audit. But the question remains open if this method will also be common post-COVID-19. If we adapt this approach also post-COVID-19, the majority of the inspections can be performed remotely when our daily routine will be back to normal. By creating a suitable risk assessment, many inspections in the future, especially those for a routine vendor qualification, can be considered as a strong, suitable method. Each company will need to consider the advantages and disadvantages of this method. I am not going into the details about advantages and disadvantages today due to the time limitations, but just to summarize, we have seen that the regulators embraced an agile approach, an agile auditing approach, in order to maintain the medicinal supply and ensure also in these times the safety of patients and the public health. This approach can be adapted and further developed for audits in general, including the vendor qualification process in the future. We only need to be very open, very open-minded against this approach. This method might be less recommended as a first audit, however, still possible. A good audit preparation, a proper communication between the parties, and usage of suitable technology are the key for a good audit practice and can be as good as an on-site audit. An agile approach can support the organization in time and money savings and contributes to the overall targets of a company. Thank you very much. This is my part.
Thank you very much.